In the shadows of a quiet town, there was a cage, not just of metal, but of fear, misunderstanding, and silence. They named him Max, a canine once hailed as a hero, now locked away like a criminal. No one visited. No one asked. No one cared. His eyes, once sharp and loyal, had grown distant, clouded by the betrayal of those he had once protected. To the world, Max was a threat. But then, she came. A little girl, small and unafraid, with questions no one dared to ask. What if the monster everyone feared was actually the guardian they abandoned? What if Max's silence was hiding the truth? This is the story of a bond that defied judgment. A child's instinct. A forgotten warrior. And a moment that changed everything. In a forgotten corner of town, where weeds cracked through pavement and the sun barely reached through the grimy glass of the old shelter, there stood a cage. Not just any cage, but one that held stories, grief, and the weight of betrayal. Inside it lay Max, a once glorious canine who had served beside officers with unmatched loyalty, his body still strong but his spirit quietly breaking. His fur, once sleek and shining with pride, was now matted in places, dulled by the passing years and the cold bite of abandonment. Every day, he would wake to the clang of metal doors and the hollow echo of footsteps that never stopped at his gate. People whispered when they walked by, parents pulling their children a little closer, shelter workers avoiding his eyes. He's dangerous, they said. Unpredictable. But no one ever asked why. No one dared to wonder what might lie behind those alert, amber eyes that watched the world with a silence that was almost human. Until one day, a little girl, no older than 10, stood in front of the cage with wide eyes and gentle steps. Her name was Emma. While others saw a threat, she saw something different, not rage, but sorrow. Not danger, but a deep, aching loneliness. She crouched down slowly, her small fingers wrapping around the cold bars, unafraid. Max, surprised by the lack of fear, lifted his head and looked at her, not with suspicion, but with something closer to hope, fragile and unsure. In that moment, time seemed to pause. For the first time in years, Max's ears perked, and a low, uncertain wag of his tail brushed the floor. Emma smiled. "Hi," she whispered. And that one word, simple, fearless, full of warmth, was enough to stir something buried deep inside the old dog's heart. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Emma returned every day. At first, she came out of sheer curiosity, her heart heavy with the thought of an abandoned, misunderstood creature behind cold bars. But what started as pity slowly transformed into something deeper, something Emma couldn't quite place. She arrived with a quiet determination each day, regardless of how tired she was after school, regardless of the weather that often seemed to mirror her mood, gray, cold, and heavy. Her steps were steady, but there was a hint of hesitance at first, as she didn't know how to approach Max. But with every passing day, she began to feel a connection. Max's eyes, once filled with weariness and wild desperation, now seemed to hold a flicker of recognition whenever he saw her. There was something almost hopeful in his gaze as he watched her, standing at the edge of his cage, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. Emma would speak to him, her voice soft but insistent, as if hoping he could understand every word. She told him stories, stories of the world outside the shelter, of the warm afternoons in the park, of the flowers she liked to pick in the spring. And when she spoke, Max would listen. His ears would perk up, his gaze steady on her as if the sound of her voice brought a sense of comfort he hadn't known in years. Each day, Emma saw subtle changes in him. His tense shoulders seemed to loosen slightly, his breath, which had once come in shallow, panicked bursts, became more even. He no longer reacted violently to the sound of footsteps, nor did he shy away when the shelter staff came near his cage. In fact, there were days now when Emma would sit on the ground beside him, her legs crossed in front of her, her voice steady and warm, while Max lay quietly beside her. There was something incredibly poignant about those moments. Emma, a young girl with so much of her life ahead of her, and Max, a dog who had seen too much, too soon, yet was beginning to trust again. She would bring him treats, carefully placing them just beyond his reach, and with a patience that spoke to the depth of her growing affection, she would wait. At first, Max wouldn't take them, his instincts too worn, his fears too strong. But eventually, he started to inch closer. And one day, as Emma extended her hand towards him, he hesitated, but only for a moment. With a slow, careful motion, he took the treat from her hand, his eyes locking with hers in a brief, silent exchange of understanding. The shelter worker, Sarah, had watched this transformation from the sidelines, initially skeptical of Emma's efforts. Sarah had seen countless dogs come and go, each one scarred in their own way, but none as deeply as Max. She had been one of the many who considered him too wild, too unpredictable. But now, as she watched Max approach the bars of his cage when Emma sat near him, Sarah felt a pang of something she hadn't expected: hope. She observed Emma's quiet, unwavering commitment, the way she gently spoke to Max as if he were a friend, not an animal. Sarah had never seen anyone approach Max this way. It was as if Emma could see something in him, something the others hadn't bothered to search for. As the weeks went on, Sarah found herself questioning the assumptions she had made. Maybe Max wasn't just a dangerous dog with a violent past. Maybe, like so many others, he just needed someone to care, someone to see beyond the fear and the scars. One afternoon, after Emma had left for the day, Sarah approached Max's cage cautiously. She was surprised by the change in him, the calmness, the quiet alertness. She could almost feel the tension that had once radiated from him dissipate in the air. Max, once so full of fear, now stood tall, his body still, but not in a way that screamed aggression. There was a quiet strength in him now, a strength that Sarah had never noticed before. It was as though he had found a sliver of peace in the presence of Emma's gentle, patient care. For the first time in months, Sarah found herself thinking, maybe there was hope for Max after all. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, soaking the city in a dreary hush that matched Emma's mood perfectly. The animal shelter was nearly empty now, the hum of flickering fluorescent lights echoing in the wide hallway. The clock on the wall had long passed closing time, but Emma hadn't moved. She sat cross-legged on the cold tile floor, her damp backpack leaning against the wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as she gazed into the kennel. Max lay inside, his body stretched out, his breathing slow and rhythmic. He no longer flinched at every sound like he used to, but he wasn't at ease either. His amber eyes were locked on her, steady and alert, as if he sensed that something had shifted between them, something unspoken and ominous. Emma let out a shaky breath and leaned forward, resting her forehead against the metal bars. The chill of it seeped into her skin, grounding her. "They told me we might have to leave," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly, and she paused before continuing. "Mom's job fell through again. She said we can't afford to stay in the city. She's already looking at apartments in some place I've never even heard of." Max shifted, his paws twitching slightly, his head rising just enough to meet her eyes. A soft, unsure whimper escaped his throat, and Emma's heart clenched. "I don't want to go, Max," she said, her fingers curling through the bars. "I don't want to leave you behind. You just started to trust me. You finally let me sit close without growling. I can't lose you too." Her voice quivered, and she looked away, blinking rapidly. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she fought them down. She didn't want Max to see her cry. He had seen enough fear in humans already. In the quiet hallway behind her, Sarah stood frozen with her keyring in hand, watching through the window. She had come to lock up, but the moment she saw Emma still there, shoulders hunched, voice trembling, her words heavy with the kind of pain a child shouldn't carry, something in her chest cracked wide open. She had always respected Emma's calm persistence, the way she showed up like clockwork without ever asking for recognition. But this was different. This was heartbreak, raw, quiet, and aching. And it wasn't just Emma's heartbreak she was witnessing. It was Max's too. His eyes followed the girl with a wary intensity that Sarah hadn't seen in months. It was as if he knew that this might be the last time she came. And the thought seemed to drain the strength from his body. Emma slowly stood up and pressed her palm to the bars one last time. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "If I don't come back. I just want you to remember you were never a bad dog. You were scared. Just like me." As she turned to leave, Max let out a low, desperate bark. It wasn't loud or aggressive, it was sorrowful, pleading. Emma stopped in her tracks, biting her lip hard as tears finally slid down her cheeks. From her spot near the doorway, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. Emma stood still, paralyzed in the corridor just a few steps away from the exit. The sound of Max's bark, a sharp, aching cry, pierced through the sterile stillness of the shelter like a bullet through glass. It wasn't just a sound. It was a plea. A desperate, soul-wrenching call that hit her harder than she ever could have prepared for. Her hand trembled slightly on the door handle. She couldn't move. Her body was there, frozen in place, but her heart had turned around the moment she heard him. That bark wasn't random. It was for her. Max knew she was leaving. And even after everything he'd endured, even after weeks of distrust, something inside him still believed in her enough to call out. She clenched her jaw, eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry again. Not today. But this wasn't fair. Not to him. Not to her. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. Emma didn't need to turn to know who it was. "Emma," Sarah said gently, her voice steady but kind, "you don't have to walk away like this." Emma slowly turned around, her eyes red and glassy. "What choice do I have?" Her voice cracked at the edges, barely holding itself together. "We're leaving the city. My mom can't take him, we don't have a house yet, and Max. He needs more than I can give. He needs safety. Structure. Someone who knows what they're doing. And I'm just," she choked down the lump in her throat. "Just a kid who got too attached." Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past Emma toward the kennel where Max stood, ears forward, his entire body straining toward the sound of Emma's voice. His eyes were wide, locked on her like she was his entire world. There was no aggression now, no tension. Just longing. Hope. A fragile kind of love. "You're not just a kid," Sarah said softly, walking up beside her. "You're the only person that dog has truly trusted since he came here. That's not something we see every day." Emma laughed bitterly, wiping at her cheek. "Yeah, and what good does that do if I still have to leave him behind?" Sarah turned to face her fully. "I've been working here a long time, Emma. I've seen dogs recover, and I've seen dogs fall apart. Max is on the edge. Without you, I'm not sure he'll make it." The words hung between them, heavy and terrifying. Emma's eyes filled again, her shoulders trembling. "I don't want to leave him, Sarah. I really don't." Sarah placed a steady hand on her back. "Then don't. At least, not forever. Let me talk to your mom. There are options, foster programs, Long-distance adoption plans. I know people. I'll fight for this, if you will. Emma blinked at her, surprised by the conviction in Sarah's voice. Why are you doing this? Because I've seen what you bring out in him. And I've seen what he brings out in you. Sarah paused, her voice softer now. You both deserve the chance to heal. Together. Emma hesitated only a second more before she took a slow, shaky step back toward the kennel. Max hadn't moved. He was still there, waiting, holding his breath like she was the only thing keeping him whole. When she reached out her hand, he didn't flinch. He leaned into it, pressing his scarred muscle against her fingers like he was afraid she might vanish. She crouched beside him, whispering, I'm not giving up on you, okay? I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. And as Max let out a low, soft whine and nudged her hand closer to his cheek, Emma realized something. She wasn't alone in this. Not anymore. The sun was still tucked behind the horizon when Emma stepped off the cold pavement and stood before the shelter once more. A thin fog clung to the early morning air, wrapping the street in quiet, ghostly silence. She clutched a folder tightly to her chest, her fingers white around the edges as she tried to still the trembling that had taken over since last night. She hadn't slept. Not a wink. Her mind had been too loud, racing with worst-case scenarios, legal jargon she barely understood, and the memory of Max's eyes, how he looked at her as if she were the only thread holding his world together. And maybe he wasn't wrong. Inside the shelter, everything looked the same. Same flickering ceiling lights, same pale blue walls that tried too hard to seem calming. But to Emma, everything had changed. Because now, Max wasn't just a rescue dog or a sad case in need of rehabilitation. He was family. And family didn't get abandoned. Sarah met her in the hallway, coffee in one hand, a clipboard in the other. She looked surprised to see Emma there so early, her red hair pulled into a haphazard ponytail, her cheeks pink from the chill. You're back, Sarah said softly. I had to be, Emma replied, her voice strained with emotion. I couldn't leave him wondering. There was a pause, quiet, but full of understanding. Then Sarah gestured toward the back. He's in kennel 5. Same spot. Emma didn't wait another second. She moved quickly, her footsteps echoing across the linoleum as she passed rows of cages. Dogs barked or stirred at her presence, but Max just sat there in silence, his head slightly tilted, eyes fixed on her as if he'd been expecting her all along. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emma dropped to her knees and pressed her hands to the cold metal bars. I found a way, she whispered, her voice trembling, but clear. It's not perfect, but it's something. I talked to a volunteer program, a short-term foster arrangement that might work while Mom and I get back on our feet. I don't know what will happen after that, but I'm not giving up on you. Not now. Not ever. Max inched forward slowly, cautiously, his nose bumping against the bars until it met her fingers. He didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. His body was no longer rigid with fear. He leaned into her touch like it was something he'd been waiting for his whole life. Emma let out a shaky breath, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. You were scared. I was too. But we're not alone anymore. As she spoke, she pulled out a crumpled photograph from her coat pocket, a picture of her and her father when she was just a child, both of them grinning beside a muddy Labrador they'd helped rescue from a flooded street. Her dad had written something on the back in his quick, messy handwriting, the ones who've been hurt the most often love the deepest. I get it now, she whispered to Max. You were waiting for someone to choose you, and I think I've been waiting for someone to save me too. Funny how we found each other, huh? Later that day, after several phone calls, paperwork, and nervous conversations with her mother, Emma returned to the kennel one last time. This time, the door was open. Max was ready. As they stepped outside together into the cold morning light, Emma held the leash in one hand, but she knew she didn't need it. Max didn't try to run. He stayed close, his head brushing against her leg with every few steps like he was making sure she was still there. And she was. "Come on," she said softly. "Let's go home. We've got a lot of healing to do." And though neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, one thing was certain: they had each other now, and that was enough to begin again. They said Max didn't deserve a second chance. That some dogs were just too broken to be saved. But what they didn't understand was this: Max wasn't broken. He was waiting. Waiting for someone to see past the scars. Past the headlines. Past the fear. And when that little girl looked into his eyes, truly looked, she didn't see a threat. She saw pain. She saw loyalty. She saw truth. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes wear collars, not medals. And sometimes, they're hidden behind locked doors and whispered rumors. Max may never return to duty. He may never chase down criminals or save lives on the front lines again. But to one child, he's already a legend. And maybe, just maybe, that's what being a hero really means. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's a story about trust, redemption, and the quiet power of being seen.